Emily Hayes was, by all accounts, the kind of teacher every parent hoped their child would have. She had an effortless ability to connect with her students, an infectious enthusiasm for learning, and a warm smile that put everyone at ease. In the small town of Wiley, Texas, Emily had built a reputation as a dedicated educator who went above and beyond for her students. Her colleagues admired her students adored her, and the community trusted her implicitly. But as the investigation into her shocking murder unfolded, the image of the kind and beloved teacher began to show cracks. Emily had moved to Wiley just a few years earlier, fresh out of college and ready to make her mark. She was young, vibrant, and eager to make a difference in the lives of her students. She quickly became a favorite among parents who praised her ability to challenge her students while still being compassionate and approachable. She spent hours after school tutoring struggling students, organizing extracurricular activities, and volunteering for school events. To everyone who knew her, Emily Hayes was the epitome of what a teacher should be. But as investigators looked deeper into Emily's life, they began to uncover details that painted a more complicated picture. While she was undeniably devoted to her students, there were whispers among some parents and staff members that her relationships with certain students went beyond what was considered professional. To most people, Emily's extra attention seemed harmless, a teacher showing a little extra care for students who needed it. But for others, there was something about her favoritism that felt off. Among the dozens of students who passed through Emily's classroom, there were three who stood out. Ryan Mitchell, a high achieving senior with a sharp wit and a troubled home life, Sarah Thompson, a shy sophomore who struggled to fit in, and Chris Jameson, a charismatic junior who seemed to thrive under Emily's guidance. Each of these students had a unique connection to Emily, and each would play a key role in unraveling the truth behind her murder. Ryan Mitchell was the kind of student teachers dream of: smart, articulate, and deeply curious. But outside the classroom, Ryan's life was anything but perfect. His parents were in the middle of a contentious divorce, and he often confided in Emily about the stress it caused him. Emily seemed to take Ryan under her wing, offering him a safe space to vent and constant source of encouragement. Ryan later described Emily as the one person who truly listened to me, a sentiment echoed by many of her students. But some of Ryan's classmates noticed that he seemed to monopolize Emily's time, often lingering in her classroom long after the final bell had rung. Sarah Thompson was the complete opposite of Ryan: quiet, reserved, and often overlooked by her peers. She struggled with low self esteem and had difficulty making friends, a fact that Emily picked up on almost immediately. Emily took it upon herself to mentor Sarah, encouraging her to join extracurricular activities and even inviting her to help with classroom projects after school. Sarah later told investigators, "Mrs. Hayes made me feel like I mattered, like I wasn't invisible." But as investigators pieced together the timeline of events leading up to Emily's murder, Sarah's name would come up again and again in ways that raised eyebrows. Then there was Chris Jameson, the star of the school's basketball team and one of the most popular students in his grade. Chris was charming, confident, and often the center of attention, both in and out of the classroom. But despite his outward confidence, Chris struggled academically and often relied on Emily for help. She spent countless hours tutoring him, even meeting with him outside of school hours to make sure he stayed on track. To his classmates, Chris seemed to have a special bond with Emily, one that some described as unusually close. It was like they had their own little world, one student later told investigators. Nobody else was allowed in. To the outside world, Emily's relationships with her students seemed perfectly normal, just a dedicated teacher going above and beyond for the kids who needed her most. But those who paid closer attention began to notice the cracks. Emily's favoritism toward Ryan, Sarah, and Chris didn't go unnoticed, and it became a topic of quiet speculation among students and staff. Some wondered if she was simply overstepping her boundaries as a teacher, while others suspected that there was more to the story than met the eye. One of Emily's colleagues, who asked to remain anonymous, later told reporters, "We all saw how much time she spent with those three kids, but nobody wanted to say anything. She was so good at what she did, and nobody wanted to believe there was anything inappropriate going on. but in hindsight, maybe we should have spoken up sooner. The students themselves seemed to thrive under Emily's attention, at least on the surface. Ryan's grades improved, Sarah became more outgoing, and Chris managed to stay eligible for the basketball team. But the closer Emily got to these students, the more complicated their relationships became. There were rumors of secret meetings, of late night text messages, and of a level of intimacy that went far beyond what anyone could have expected. And as the investigation into Emily's murder unfolded, these rumors would take center stage. Investigators interviewed dozens of students, teachers, and parents, piecing together a timeline of events that painted a picture of a woman who cared deeply for her students, but may have crossed a line. As one investigator later put it, Emily Hayes was a complex person. She was kind, she was caring, but she also made choices that had serious consequences, choices that ultimately led to her death. The question now was whether Emily's relationships with Ryan, Sarah, and Chris were simply the result of a devoted teacher trying to help her students, or whether there was something far more troubling beneath the surface. And as the investigation continued, the answers would prove to be more shocking than anyone could have imagined. The first whispers began quietly, almost unnoticed. It started with a subtle glance here, a shared laugh there, and eventually a series of interactions that some students described as unusually close. Emily Hayes was known for being approachable and friendly, but to a few observant classmates, there was something about the way she interacted with certain students that raised questions, questions that few dared to ask out loud. It was during her AP English class that the first rumors began to spread. A student sitting at the back of the room noticed Ryan Mitchell's phone screen light up. At first, it seemed harmless, just another teenager scrolling through his messages during class. But what caught their attention was the name on the screen: Miss Hayes. The message was brief, casual even, but the student couldn't help but wonder why their teacher would be texting Ryan during school hours. For Ryan, those late night messages from Emily were a lifeline. They started as simple check ins: How are you holding up? Or did you finish your essay? But as Ryan opened up about his parents' divorce and the emotional toll it was taking on him, the tone of the conversations began to shift. Emily, who saw herself as a mentor and confidant, offered words of encouragement and advice. "You're stronger than you think, Ryan," she wrote in one message. "You'll get through this, and I'm here if you need to talk." For a teenager navigating a turbulent home life, Emily's support felt like a beacon of hope. But the more Ryan relied on Emily for emotional support, the more their relationship blurred the lines between teacher and student. Classmates began to notice how much time Ryan spent in Emily's classroom after school, often long after everyone else had gone home. One student later described it as weird, but not completely out of character for her. She cared a lot about her students, but with Ryan, it felt different. It felt personal. These small observations, insignificant on their own, began to form the foundation of a larger story that no one could yet see. While Ryan's connection with Emily was the first to attract attention, it was far from the only one. Sarah Thompson, the quiet sophomore who had always struggled to fit in, found herself drawn to Emily in much the same way. Emily's encouragement gave Sarah a sense of confidence she had never felt before, and the two began spending more time together outside of school. Emily invited Sarah to help with class projects, to join her at church events, and even to babysit her young daughter. But what Sarah didn't realize was that her newfound closeness to Emily was beginning to draw attention. Other students noticed how often Sarah stayed behind after class, or how she seemed to have a direct line to Emily when she needed advice. One student recalled overhearing a conversation in the hallway. Sarah was talking about how Miss Hayes texted her late at night to check on her. I remember thinking, that's kind of weird for a teacher to do. These small moments, unnoticed by most, would later take on a far greater significance. Then there was Chris Jameson, the charismatic junior whose struggles in the classroom contrasted sharply with his popularity on the basketball court. Emily had taken a special interest in Chris, offering him extra tutoring sessions and encouraging him to stay focused on his academics. At first, their relationship seemed purely professional, just a teacher helping a struggling student. But as Chris spent more time with Emily, their interactions began to take on a different tone. Classmates noticed the way Chris lingered near her desk after class, the way he seemed to hang on her every word. One student later described it as like he was her favorite, like he could do no wrong in her eyes. For Emily, these relationships were an extension of her dedication as a teacher. She saw herself as a mentor, someone who could guide her students through their struggles and help them realize their potential. But what she didn't see, or perhaps refused to see, was how her actions appeared to those around her. To the students who weren't part of her inner circle, Emily's favoritism felt unfair, even uncomfortable. And as the rumors began to spread, so did the tension. The turning point came when one of the students confided in a friend. It wasn't a dramatic revelation, just a casual comment about how close they had become to Miss Hayes. But that comment, repeated and embellished as it passed from one student to another, set off a chain reaction that would ultimately lead to the truth. By the time the rumors reached the ears of parents and school administrators, they had taken on a life of their own. Suddenly, Emily's late night messages and after school meetings weren't just acts of kindness, they were something much more complicated. Emily, for her part, seemed oblivious to the growing scrutiny. She continued to offer support to Ryan, Sarah, and Chris, unaware, or perhaps to acknowledge, that her actions were raising red flags. But the walls were closing in, and it was only a matter of time before her double life began to unravel. As one investigator later put it, Emily Hayes thought she was helping these kids, but in reality, she was crossing boundaries that should never be crossed, and the consequences were devastating. What began as innocent conversations had spiraled into something far more complicated, something that would ultimately cost Emily her life. The question now was simple: how far had these relationships gone, and who knew the full truth? The answers, as investigators would soon discover, were more shocking than anyone could have imagined. The events leading up to the night of the murder were marked by subtle, unsettling changes. Emily Hayes, once the picture of confidence and calm, began to show signs that something in her life was becoming unmanageable. Students who once admired her noticed her mood swings, moments of warmth and patience giving way to episodes of distraction and tension. Teachers who worked alongside her whispered among themselves about her sudden irritability and uncharacteristic forgetfulness. And for the three students closest to her, these changes were even more pronounced. Ryan Mitchell, Sarah Thompson, and Chris Jameson were no longer just three students navigating the challenges of high school. Their lives had become intertwined with Emily's in ways that no one outside their circle could fully understand. But as time passed, the strain of these connections began to show. Ryan, who had always been the high achiever, started skipping classes and turning in assignments late. Sarah, who had blossomed under Emily's encouragement, began withdrawing from her classmates, avoiding eye contact and spending long hours alone in the library. And Chris, the charismatic athlete, became noticeably agitated, often snapping at teammates during practice and lashing out at friends without warning. Parents and teachers started to notice these changes, but few connected them directly to Emily. For most, it seemed like typical teenage behavior, nothing more than the natural turbulence of adolescence. But for those paying closer attention, there were signs that something deeper was at play. One parent, who later spoke to investigators, described a conversation they overheard between their child and a classmate. They were talking about how Ryan and Miss Hayes were always texting each other. I remember thinking, why would a teacher be texting a student late at night? The tension came to a head during the final weeks of the school year. Arguments between the three students became more frequent, often erupting in hallways or during lunch. One teacher recalled witnessing a heated exchange between Chris and Ryan outside the gym. They were yelling at each other, and I could tell it wasn't about something small. It looked personal. Sarah, meanwhile, seemed caught in the middle, torn between her loyalty to Emily and her growing discomfort with the situation. She looked scared, another student later said, like she didn't know what to do or who to trust. Emily, for her part, seemed increasingly desperate to keep everything under control. She began isolating herself from her colleagues, avoiding the staff lounge, and spending more time behind closed doors in her classroom. On one occasion, a fellow teacher found her sitting alone after school, staring blankly at a stack of ungraded papers. She looked exhausted, the teacher later recalled. I asked her if she was okay, and she just nodded and said she was fine, but I could tell she wasn't. Despite the growing tension, Emily continued to communicate with the three students, often through text messages and private meetings. But these interactions, meant to provide reassurance, only seemed to heighten the stakes. Ryan, who had always seen Emily as a source of stability, began to feel possessive of her time and attention. Chris, struggling with his own frustrations, started accusing Ryan of monopolizing Emily's support. And Sarah, caught between the two, found herself increasingly isolated, her trust in Emily beginning to erode. It wasn't long before rumors about Emily and the students reached the ears of the school administration. An anonymous tip led to a meeting between Emily and the principal, during which she was asked about her relationships with Ryan, Sarah, and Chris. Emily denied any wrongdoing, insisting that her actions were motivated purely by a desire to help her students. But the principal, while sympathetic, issued a warning. You need to be more careful. People are starting to talk. For Emily, the principal's warning was a wake-up call, but it came too late. The damage had already been done. The tension between the students had reached a breaking point, and the fragile balance Emily had tried to maintain was beginning to collapse. In the days leading up to the murder, witnesses reported seeing Ryan and Chris in yet another argument, this time in the parking lot after school. They were shouting at each other, one student recalled. I couldn't hear everything, but I heard Chris say, "You think you're the only one who matters? You're not." On the morning of June 13th, Emily arrived at school early, as she often did. Colleagues noticed she seemed quieter than usual, her smile strained and her eyes shadowed with fatigue. She spent most of the day in her classroom, avoiding unnecessary interactions and focusing on preparing for the end of the semester. But as the afternoon wore on, her phone buzzed repeatedly with messages from Ryan, Sarah, and Chris. By the time the final bell rang, Emily's calm exterior had begun to crack. That evening, Emily returned home to her quiet suburban neighborhood, where the streets were lined with neatly trimmed lawns and the air was filled with the sounds of children playing outside. To her neighbors, it seemed like any other night. But inside Emily's home, the tension that had been building for months was about to reach its tragic conclusion. At 8:42 p.m., a neighbor reported hearing raised voices coming from Emily's house. The argument, they said, lasted for several minutes before ending abruptly. Another neighbor, who had stepped outside to water their plants, later described seeing a shadow pass by one of Emily's windows, followed by the sound of something heavy falling to the floor. It was strange, they said, but I didn't think much of it at the time. I just assumed it was nothing. By the next morning, the news of what had happened inside Emily Hayes's home would spread across the town, leaving a community in shock and disbelief. The details of that night would remain unclear for weeks, but one thing was certain: the tragedy that unfolded on that warm summer night in June would leave a mark on Wiley that no one would ever forget. The morning after the events that shook the quiet town of Wiley, Texas, began like any other. Students shuffled into the school building, the faint hum of chatter echoing through the hallways. Teachers prepared their lessons, oblivious to the fact that one of their own wouldn't be joining them that day. The first sign that something was wrong came just before 7:30 a.m. when the school's janitor unlocked Emily Hayes's classroom door. What he found would change everything. The janitor, who had worked at the school for over a decade, noticed the smell first. It wasn't something he could immediately identify, but it stopped him in his tracks. As he stepped further into the room, he saw papers scattered across the floor, chairs overturned, and Emily's desk in complete disarray. It was then that he noticed the pool of blood near the back of the room, and there, partially obscured by a toppled bookshelf, was the body of Emily Hayes. The janitor immediately called 911, his voice shaking as he tried to describe what he had seen. Police arrived within minutes, sealing off the area and ushering students and staff away from the scene. What they found inside Emily's classroom was a chaotic and deeply unsettling tableau. There were signs of a violent struggle, broken glass, scattered belongings, and bloodstains that told a story of a desperate fight for survival. Emily's body lay motionless, this her injuries, telling a story that investigators would spend weeks trying to piece together. As officers began their initial examination of the scene, it became clear that this was no random act of violence. Emily's injuries suggested that the attack had been personal, deliberate. Detectives noted the absence of any signs of forced entry, leading them to believe that Emily had willingly let her attacker into the room. The discovery of her cell phone, shattered and lying near her body, provided the first clue, a series of text messages sent and received in the hours leading up to her death. By midday, news of Emily's murder had spread across the town. Parents arrived at the school in droves, some in tears, others desperate for answers. Students were sent home early, many of them confused and frightened by the sudden chaos. Local news crews descended on the scene, their cameras capturing the faces of a community reeling from the loss of a beloved teacher. One anchor described the atmosphere as tense and heartbroken, a sentiment shared by nearly everyone in Wiley that day. As investigators worked to piece together the events of the previous night, they focused their attention on Emily's phone records. The text messages revealed a flurry of communication between Emily and three of her students, Ryan Mitchell, Sarah Thompson, and Chris Jameson. The messages, though cryptic, hinted at a meeting planned for the evening of her death. One message sent from Emily's phone at 6:47 p.m. read, "We need to talk. Meet me after school." Another, sent by Ryan an hour later, simply said, "I'm on my way." These messages, combined with witness accounts from neighbors, began to form a timeline of the events leading up to Emily's death. Investigators learned that Ryan had been seen entering the school around 7:30 p.m., carrying what appeared to be a backpack. Shortly afterwards, Sarah and Chris were spotted near the parking lot, their expressions described by one witness as anxious and on edge. What happened next would remain a mystery for weeks, as the three students provided conflicting accounts of their whereabouts that night. As detectives continued their investigation, they discovered additional evidence that pointed to a premeditated plan. Security footage from the school's entrance showed Ryan and Chris entering the building together, their faces obscured by the dim lighting. Sarah, who initially claimed she had stayed home that night, was later seen on a second camera entering through a side door. These details, while not definitive, painted a picture of coordination, of a group of individuals who had come together for a purpose that no one could yet understand. In the days that followed, police questioned dozens of students and staff members, searching for any information that could shed light on Emily's relationships with Ryan, Sarah, and Chris. What they uncovered was a series of rumors and half-truths that suggested a level of intimacy between Emily and the students that many found unsettling. One teacher, who spoke on condition of anonymity, described Emily's behavior as unusual but not overtly inappropriate. "She cared deeply for those kids," the teacher said, "maybe too deeply." The evidence began to mount, and the narrative of Emily's final hours grew increasingly complex. Forensic analysis of the classroom revealed multiple sets of fingerprints, including those of Ryan, Sarah, and Chris. A partially torn piece of paper found near Emily's desk contained what appeared to be fragments of a handwritten note. "We can't keep doing this. It's too dangerous." The note, while incomplete, provided a chilling glimpse into the emotions that may have fueled the events of that night. By the end of the week, police had identified Ryan, Sarah, and Chris as persons of interest. The three students were brought in for questioning, their responses scrutinized for inconsistencies. Ryan, visibly shaken, insisted he had only gone to the school to talk to Emily about a personal matter. Sarah, her voice trembling, claimed she had no idea what had happened and maintained that she had never entered the classroom. Chris, however, provided a different story, one that placed all three students at the scene of the crime. The case was far from solved, but the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place. As investigators prepared to present their findings, the community of Wiley braced itself for the answers they had been waiting for, and the shocking truth that would come to light. The investigation into Emily Hayes' murder quickly became the highest priority for the Wiley Police Department. With the discovery of evidence pointing to three of her own students, the case presented a complex web of relationships, motives, and secrets that detectives would need to untangle. What began as a routine crime scene investigation rapidly turned into a deeper exploration of Emily's personal and professional life and the shocking connections she had formed with Ryan Mitchell, Sarah Thompson, and Chris Jameson. Detectives began their work by reviewing the evidence collected from the crime scene. The text messages on Emily's shattered phone were the first major clue, revealing that she had been in contact with all three students in the hours leading up to her death. The messages, while not explicit, hinted at a confrontation. "We need to fix this," one read. Another simply said, "It's too late to go back now." The language was cryptic, but it was enough to suggest that Emily and the students were entangled in something much larger than anyone had realized. Police then turned their attention to the school's security footage. The grainy black and white video showed Ryan and Chris entering the building together around 7:30 p.m. Moments later, Sarah was captured entering through a side door. The footage, while circumstantial, placed all three students at the scene of the crime on the night of Emily's death. Combined with the fingerprints found at the scene, detectives had enough to bring the students in for questioning. Ryan Mitchell was the first to be interviewed. Sitting across from detectives in a cold, sterile interrogation room, he appeared nervous but cooperative. He admitted to meeting Emily that evening, but insisted he had left before anything happened. "I just wanted to talk to her," he said. "We were trying to work things out." When pressed about what they were trying to work out, Ryan became evasive, his answers growing shorter and more defensive. Sarah Thompson's interview painted a different picture. She initially denied being at the school that night, but when confronted with the security footage, her story began to unravel. Through tears, she admitted to entering the building but claimed she had only done so because Emily had asked her to meet. She said it was important, Sarah told investigators. "I didn't know anything bad was going to happen." Detectives noted her trembling hands and the way she avoided eye contact, suggesting she was holding back critical details. Chris Jameson, however, provided the most troubling account. Unlike Ryan and Sarah, Chris was visibly agitated during his interview. He repeatedly insisted that he had nothing to do with Emily's death, but contradicted himself several times when asked about the timeline of events. At one point, he blurted out, "I didn't want to be there. I told them this was a bad idea." The detective, sensing an opportunity, pressed him for more information, but Chris, realizing he had said too much, clammed up, refusing to answer any more questions without a lawyer. As the interrogations continued, detectives began piecing together a timeline based on the students' statements, text messages, and security footage. What emerged was a story of escalating tension and fractured relationships. Ryan, Sarah, and Chris had each developed a unique bond with Emily, but those bonds had become strained in the weeks leading up to her death. Arguments over jealousy, loyalty, and perceived favoritism had created a volatile situation, one that ultimately exploded on the night of the murder. Community reaction to the unfolding case was swift and emotional. Parents, teachers, and students struggled to reconcile the image of the three promising young individuals they had known with the allegations now being made against them. Ryan Mitchell had been a model student destined for a prestigious college. Sarah Thompson, once shy and overlooked, had blossomed into a confident young woman under Emily's mentorship. And Chris Jameson, the star athlete, had been a source of pride for the school's basketball program. To see these three students implicated in such a horrific crime left the community reeling. At a hastily called school board meeting, parents demanded answers, their voices filled with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "How could this happen?" one parent shouted. "What was going on in that classroom that no one saw this coming?" Teachers, too, struggled to make sense of the tragedy. Many expressed guilt for not noticing the signs earlier, while others defended Emily, insisting she had always acted with the best intentions. One teacher, speaking anonymously, said, "Emily was passionate about her work. She cared deeply for her students. I don't think she ever meant for things to get this far." The media, meanwhile, descended on Wiley, turning the town into the epicenter of a national story. News outlets ran headlines that read, "Teacher's Murder Shocks Texas Town," and "Three Students Arrested in Grisly School Crime." Reporters camped outside the school and police station, eager for any new developments. As details of the case began to emerge, public opinion became sharply divided. Some sympathized with the students, blaming the pressures of adolescence and the complexities of their relationships with Emily. Others condemned them outright, calling for swift justice. On the third day of the investigation, police executed search warrants at the homes of all three students. At Ryan's house, they discovered a notebook containing handwritten letters addressed to Emily, detailing his feelings of admiration and frustration. At Sarah's, they found a journal entry from the night of the murder in which she wrote, "I wish I hadn't gone. I should have said no." And at Chris's, they recovered a pair of shoes with traces of what appeared to be blood, later confirmed to match Emily's. With this new evidence, detectives felt they had enough to make arrests. On a quiet Friday afternoon, Ryan Mitchell, Sarah Thompson, and Chris Jameson were each taken into custody. The news of their arrests sent shockwaves through the town. Parents clutched their children tightly, students whispered nervously in the hallways, and teachers grappled with the realization that this tragedy had unfolded right under their noses. "We're all in shock," one parent said. "These were kids with bright futures. How did it come to this?" As the three students sat in separate holding cells awaiting their initial court appearances, the town of Wiley braced itself for the next chapter of this tragic story. The arrests marked the end of one chapter, but for investigators, it was only the beginning. The question now was no longer who had killed Emily Hayes, but why. And the answers to that question would prove to be as shocking as the crime itself. The arrests of Ryan Mitchell, Sarah Thompson, and Chris Jameson marked the beginning of a long and painful journey for the town of Wiley. What had once been a close-knit community defined by trust and familiarity was now divided by questions, rumors, and the weight of an unspeakable tragedy. For the families of the accused, the shock was almost unbearable. They had raised children with bright futures, only to see them thrust into the national spotlight as suspects in a brutal murder. For Emily Hayes' family, the grief was immeasurable, their loss magnified by the growing attention surrounding the case. The trial began 6 months later, with media outlets from across the country descending on the small town. The courtroom, packed with reporters, lawyers, and spectators, became a stage for one of the most sensational cases in Texas history. Each day brought new revelations as prosecutors and defense attorneys sparred over the events leading up to Emily's death. The narrative that emerged was as complex as it was heartbreaking. Prosecutors argued that Emily's relationships with the students had created a volatile situation fueled by jealousy and resentment. They presented evidence of late-night text messages, secret meetings, and emotional entanglements that had blurred the lines between teacher and student. Witnesses testified to seeing arguments between Ryan, Sarah, and Chris in the weeks leading up to the murder, and forensic experts detailed how their fingerprints and DNA placed them at the scene of the crime. This was not a random act of violence, the lead prosecutor said during closing arguments. This was the result of a series of decisions that led to a tragic and irreversible outcome. The defense, however, painted a different picture. They argued that Emily had crossed professional boundaries, creating an unhealthy dynamic that ultimately spiraled out of control. While they did not deny that the students had been present at the school that night, they insisted that the murder had not been premeditated. Instead, they claimed it was the result of a heated confrontation that escalated in ways no one could have anticipated. "These are teenagers," one defense attorney said. "They were confused, overwhelmed, and caught in a situation they couldn't handle. This is a tragedy, not a calculated crime." For the residents of Wiley, the trial was both a spectacle and a source of deep pain. Parents struggled to explain the case to their children, many of whom had been classmates of Ryan, Sarah, and Chris. Teachers, grappling with their own guilt and grief, questioned how they could have missed the warning signs. And for Emily's family, the daily recounting of her final hours was a cruel reminder of the life that had been taken from them. As the trial progressed, the emotional toll on everyone involved became increasingly evident. Ryan, once a confident and articulate student, appeared withdrawn and hollow-eyed as he sat in the defendant's chair. Sarah, her hands trembling, often avoided looking at the jury, her voice cracking when she took the stand to testify. Chris, the charismatic athlete, seemed a shadow of his former self. His shoulders slumped and his expressions vacant. Their parents, seated in the gallery, watched in silence, their faces etched with a mixture of sorrow and disbelief. After weeks of testimony, the jury was sent to deliberate. For hours, the courtroom remained in tense silence as everyone waited for a verdict. Finally, after nearly 2 days, the jury returned with their decision. Ryan Mitchell was found guilty of second-degree murder, his role in the events deemed the most direct and deliberate. Sarah Thompson, whose involvement was described as passive but complicit, was convicted of manslaughter. Chris Jameson, who had been portrayed as a reluctant participant, was found guilty of accessory to murder. The sentences, though varying in length, ensured that all three students would serve time in prison. The verdicts brought some measure of closure, but for many in Wiley, the wounds remained fresh. Emily's family expressed gratitude for the outcome, but emphasized that no sentence could ever bring her back. "We've lost a daughter, a sister, and a friend," her father said in a tearful statement outside the courthouse. Nothing can change that, but we hope this serves as a lesson about the importance of boundaries and accountability. For the community, the aftermath of the trial was marked by a period of deep reflection. School administrators implemented stricter policies regarding teacher-student interactions, hoping to prevent similar tragedies in the future. Counseling services were offered to students and staff, many of whom continued to grapple with the emotional fallout. "It's going to take time for us to heal," the school principal said in a statement, "but we're committed to learning from this and supporting one another as we move forward." The case also sparked a broader conversation about the pressures faced by both teachers and students. Experts weighed in on the importance of clear boundaries and the potential consequences of crossing them. Parents, many of whom had previously trusted the school system without question, became more vigilant, seeking to ensure their children's safety and well-being. "This has been a wake-up call for all of us," one parent said. "We need to be more involved, more aware, and more willing to ask difficult questions." Years later, the scars of what happened in Wiley remain. The school has moved on, but the memories linger in quiet corners of classrooms and hallways. Ryan, Sarah, and Chris have served their sentences and begun rebuilding their lives, though they carry with them the weight of their actions. Emily's family continues to honor her memory, advocating for greater awareness and accountability in schools across the country. And for the town of Wiley, the question that lingers is one that has no easy answer. How did it come to this? How did a respected teacher's life end in such a senseless tragedy? And could anyone have stopped it before it was too late? If you think cases like this deserve more attention and discussion, be sure to subscribe and join us for more gripping stories like this one.